Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Faculty Spotlight Series featuring Professor Dustin Tyler from the Case School of Engineering. The Faculty Spotlight Series provides an opportunity for members of our outstanding faculty to share highlights about their research with Case Western Reserve supporters and friends. We are all so pleased that you could join us tonight, and we thank you for your continued support of this university. In just a few moments, you'll hear from Dr. Dustin Tyler as he shares his presentation, The Human Unlimited, Amplifying Human Capability Beyond Biological Boundaries. Wow. But first, I'd like to introduce Jim McGiffin-Hawley, our interim VP for Research, who will moderate the Q&A that will follow Dr. Tyler's presentation. Jim is the faculty director of the Larry Sears and Sally Zotnik Sears Think Box and the Arthur S. Holden Professor at the Case School of Engineering. Jim has been a faculty member at Case Western Reserve since 1991, and he served in a number of administrative roles. We appreciate his insight, leadership, and contributions in every office he's held. Thank you, Jim. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dustin Tyler, the Kent H. Smith II Professor of Biomedical Engineering at the Case School of Engineering. He has a secondary appointment as a principal investigator at the Lewis Stokes Cleveland Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and he is the associate director of the Advanced Platform for Technology Center, which is the Department of Veteran Affairs Rehabilitation Research and Development National Center. Dustin has been a faculty member here at Case Western Reserve for more than 15 years, and he is known for his expertise in directly connecting humans and technology to improve human performance and capability. He and his colleagues at the university's Human Fusion Institute are finding ways to work in environments that are unsuitable for humans, such as outer space or patient isolation wards. They're also finding ways to provide a sense of touch for those with prosthetic limbs. And they're finding ways to make multiplayer online gaming, better known as MMO, even more of a realistic depth perceiving sensory experience. Very cool stuff indeed. Dr. Tyler is a member of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. He's had more than $30 million in funding from the VA, the NIH, the NSF, and DARPA, and more than 25 issued US and international patents, with another 30 patents pending. He received his BS degree in electrical engineering from Michigan Technological University, and we're proud that he earned his PhD in biomedical engineering right here at Case Western Reserve. Thank you for your work and your important research. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dustin.
Great. Thank you, President Kaler. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight and for everybody tuning in. I heard this might be the last time we're virtual, which I have mixed feelings about. One, I like the in-person, but it's great to have the ability for many people to join us. So I appreciate that. So there's three things that I want to kind of get across today. There's three main points for my talk. Essentially that humans and technology co-evolve, and that we're ultimately on the brink of a new relationship and that evolution of that connection of humans and technology. The second thing is that Case Western Reserve University has really been on the forefront of the technology and human mix in interaction since even the late 60s, when the biomedical engineering program here, the department which I'm part of, was officially formed as one of the first 5 in the country. And I think, like in '68, when this initially was formed, we have the opportunity to think beyond what we've done in the beginning with the biomedical application and take what we've learned in the human technology and actually move that to a much broader application and ability for improving what humans are capable of doing and how we move forward. So tonight for the talk, I have it really in 3 basic parts that we're going to go through. One is I'll talk about what I'll call this neural digital interface, how we connect between the human nervous system and devices. I'm going to give a specific example of work that we've done. We've spending the last 10 years on and made great progress in the area of prosthetics, particularly for people with limb loss and restoring sensation. There's been a medical purpose for that, but it's actually helped us learn a ton about humans and machines interact, which is what we're then going to take to this third section. It's allowing us to think beyond what we've done before in this idea of this neural digital connection to technology. And I'm going to talk about why I think this is the opportunity for a destructive or a constructive, disruptive change in the way that we interact with technology and our world. So with that, I kind of want to give you an example, very simple. I think most of us can appreciate of how technology really is intertwined with our lives. I won't give you the exact age of either myself, which I don't care, or my wife, which would get me hurt. But ultimately, at one point, she told me that my eyes would go bad around age 40. And, I had great vision. I thought, I'm happy to say I made it to age 43. So, However, I remember at that point where it started to get to the point where I couldn't read. And I think many of us experienced that, but a simple pair of glasses changed everything. And what the thing that this points out to me, or just want to kind of make an essence about, is imagine if we didn't have glasses, if we didn't have this simple form of technology, at that point, I wouldn't have been able to interact or continue the work I'm doing, or even think of those that can't read early on or need corrective vision from the beginning. That would have essentially eliminated those folks from this ability to read, to connect, to develop technology, and develop science and moving forward altogether. So a simple example of that, we all are dependent on technology or advance because of technology, sort of points out this idea that really humanity creates new technology, but technology allows advancement in humanity. And so we're more than any other species, I think, and maybe any other, is that we are dependent and co-evolving with our technology continuously. And so I think what I want to talk about is how I view the opportunity to take advantage of that ultimately, or where I think we can take this in the next step for where we're going. So I'll give you a little background on myself, just a bit of a story how I got here and how this relates to kind of what I'm doing. Is that my first purchase, I save up my money, and people maybe go buy sports equipment or bikes. My first purchase was an Atari 800 XL computer. Not for gaming, but actually to write programs and start coding. I was fascinated by the computer, how, electrical engineering, computing. Now, this was in the 80s that I did this, and computers were just starting to be available to the everyday person. I didn't have enough money to buy myself a floppy disk drive, which is, for those of us that know what that is, that's the storage medium, which may have had a couple hundred K at most, but I couldn't even afford that. So I just had this computer, you plugged it into your TV, and you turned it on, and it popped up with a prompt where I could start writing basic programs. And I would do that for hours, turn it off and lose it, and then the next day it'd start right up again. I was fascinated by how the computer worked. This might also explain why I didn't get married till much later in my life, but that's a whole nother story altogether. So this fascination for me then actually led into this idea of thinking about the human computer, if you would, or at least what we think of as the human computer in many instances, which is the brain, the human nervous system. So I began, most of my career has had this fascination of how electrical systems, computer systems, the computational ideas, and now more neural net and machine learning is based on how the brain works, but also informs how computer systems work. And so back and forth, and then we can learn from computers how we can interact with the brain. So I've always been fascinated with this connection. And ultimately, my career started, as an electrical engineer, but when I came to CASE, I really began to ask the question of how do we connect to the brain? Like, there is no USB port, there isn't a port that we connect into. So how is it that we can actually connect, interact, and talk with the brain and find that for a functional purpose? And so what we realize is that the brain essentially is connected to the world through our periphery, through our senses. While we hear a lot about brain-computer interfaces and directly, connections to the cortex, Elon Musk and Neuralink, if you've heard of that work, and things that are going on, the brain doesn't connect to the world that way. The brain connects to the world through our senses, whether it be touch or vision or taste or smell or the other senses of our body. And so the way that system works is we have the peripheral, and then we have what we call the nerves, the nervous system. And so these are effectively the wiring of the body. That, for example, if you touch the finger in the pad of the finger, there'll be an activation there. And then there's one long wire, it's one cell that extends up the entire length of my arm that goes into the spinal cord. And so that one cell carries that information all the way up and then to the brain. And so the brain is the central processing unit. It's this complex, beautiful system that we still don't completely understand. But it's fascinating how it takes this information from the world around us and creates who we are, our understanding, our complexity. But everywhere from the finger to the spinal cord is one long wire. Once we get to the spinal cord, there's all kinds of processing and circuitry. The computer analogies is little computer processing units all the way up in here, the neural processing units. And so I spent most of my career interested in connecting to that brain, so being able to input system into the brain, and then also the output system. So when the brain decides to move a muscle, it sends a signal down the spinal cord and out through these, again, single wires into the muscle to cause it to move. And so that's fundamentally the input and output of the brain. So no matter how complex and beautiful it is, That is the system where we connect to the world. And so my interest has been, how do we tap into that wire at the end, if you will, the peripheral nerve, to be able to interpret, to connect, to talk to the brain, to use the brain to go back and forth. And so the beginning of my career was really developing this interface. And so this is a depiction of this peripheral nerve. This is one of these wide, long yellow wires. And within that, they're all bundled together to each individual we call an axon. That's the specific wire. So a single cell that connects to your fingertip for one sort of touch will produce that information, send it up, all the way up this wire. Then all the sensors on our fingers are bundled together to a bigger group, and those all run together from the hand up to the brain. So there is some body-related organization in these wiring here in the peripheral. What that allows us to do is create a digital system, an electrical system that we can put around the nerve. And my colleagues and people well before me understood the physics and the electrical systems of this that we utilize. So neural engineering, Case Western Reserve University has probably been, and still is, one of the top premier groups in the world doing this. We have over 100 different investigators across the clinical and academic group here in Cleveland that are working on this. But what we know is we can connect electrical signals to each of these little gray bars in this picture would represent an individual contact or point at which we could interact with the nerve. And if I apply a current to a small part of this, to this electrode, this small part, I can activate a few of the wires in a specific region. And so the way the nerve is arranged is you might have the index finger on one side, you might have the thumb in another place. And if I can distribute those contacts as individual points of access in such a way that I can activate just the finger or just the thumb, effectively, I can now reproduce that sense of touch to this individual or this connection by each of these individual wires. And it's not just touch, it's actually any connection to the body. And so this interface allows us to do many, many different things depending on where we place it in the body and what the person needs us to replace. It could be in the peripheral nerves. It could also be in the autonomic system, which are the ones that control the heart rate or the stomach or other parts of your body. So the idea of this interface that we developed was that it was simple surgically to implement. So one of the advantages of working here in Cleveland and the Case Western University area is that we work very closely with clinicians and physicians. So we don't just build technology that looks cool and it's great for paper. We actually build technology that's going to work for the people that need it. And that's been a huge element of what we've done, because we've been able to now not just produce what we can do in preclinical models, we've been able to put this in people. And now we have these electrodes that for more than a decade have been in people doing continuous functional restoration for the work that we're doing. And I'll present a couple examples in a second here. Well over 15 subjects and actually we're probably in the plus 20 in that area. So people that actually have this technology implanted that we're learning from every day. So this is basically my neural digital connection here and how I talk to that wonderful computer system that we call the brain. What can we do with that? Some of the clinical research applications just by introduction, and a lot of different people that I work with to do this. So, I work with hundreds of different people that are super critical for moving this work forward. I'm just presenting work from a lot of people here. But ultimately, some of the areas that we've made from a medical condition perspective is, for example, dysphagia following stroke or other central deficits. Swallowing becomes very difficult, and dysphagia is a fancy term for swallowing difficulty. So if you eat something, a lot of times if the swallow process isn't coordinated appropriately, the stuff will go down into your lungs, and that leads to pneumonia and often either hospitalization or death. So we've created tools that can improve that swallowing. Within spinal cord injury, for people that no longer have they have a spinal cord injury, so the brain is no longer connected to that peripheral system, we can now record with my colleague Blue Ajaboy and Bob Kirsch and other people, we can record from the brain. Then we can use that information externally in an engineered system to tell how to connect back to this muscle system to give their hand function again, for example. And so then in hypertension, we now can work with the autonomic system. We can, for people that aren't responsive to medication, we can actually tap into the system that normally controls blood pressure and work with that to control blood pressure in a non-pharmacological way. And this, I'm happy to say, has been recently licensed to a corporate. And then in diabetes, we're looking about ways where diabetes is a peripheral vascular disease that usually starts from the distal, like in the end of your feet. As it comes up, you begin to get numb. So the nerve maybe is still or painful or numb. And so the nerve may still be working proximally, but we can interact and give people the sense of their foot still and maybe put off some of the consequences such as amputation, those with diabetes, to some new areas. So these are 4 example areas that we're using these neural digital interfaces to improve health. So I presented one interface. That interface is a surgical interface. Some of the work that we're currently trying to do is to develop these neural digital interfaces that either don't require surgery. So I'll go into details, but how can we connect to that nerve without actually cutting, if you will, so gloves or other non-invasive implants, or trying to find ways that don't require surgery. So maybe something with a hypodermic needle, like a shot, and basically technology that we could get into that nerve just by doing a in-clinic shot or something like that, and then leaving a minimal interface. And so these are some of the current directions to try and take our neural digital to a broader audience and non-surgical implementation. I'm not going to talk about the one in the middle, but I will show you examples of where we've been starting to use this on the outside as we talk about the broader capabilities of what this neural digital connection is going to give us. So let me switch now to the second part, which talks about a very specific example, and I think it will lead us into what I think the bigger picture of what we're trying to do is. So let me start with a little bit of a story. I was up until I started doing this work, I was an engineer. Everything was about function, it was about equations, it was about building stuff. But I met a man who told me his story, and he basically said, one day I went to work. He was a repairman. He worked I think it was a industrial laundry facility, and so he was repairing a conveyor belt, reaching up underneath and doing what he had to do. And of course, but what happens a lot of times, things weren't turned off properly. It turned on, caught his arm, and essentially took it off. And so he lost his arm in an instant. Went to work one day and then came back without an arm. Well, he went to the hospital, obviously, but lost his arm that day. And while we think that's tragic, what really got me was in talking to him further about the impact that had on his life. So it wasn't just that he lost his arm. He comes from a part of the country where, he was the core breadwinner, and the loss of his arm took that away, which had a very personal identity aspect with it as well. And we've worked with many different, now several different people have lost their arm or lost their limb. And the psychological impact is amazing. I mean, it's horrifying as to the self-worth, the sense of being complete. All these different things were taken away from them in a moment. And so the impact of that's well beyond just losing their arm. However, what really got me even further was he's talking about his recovery period in terms of when he had lost his limb, was dealing with these aspects of the psychological side. And then he told us that we asked him, what is it that you want from this program? Why are you volunteering to be part of this research where we can restore that sense of touch for you? And what he said was, through the recovery process, the only thing that got him through, and one really important part of his mental recovery, was his niece. And they would go walking together. And what he said was, she would never hold my intact hand, my remaining limb. She would always hold the prosthetic. And he said the one thing that he really wanted, the reason he was participating in this study, was that someday that when she walked with him, he could hold her hand and feel it. And to me, that was really a life-changing moment for me as well, because what I realized is that what we do is not about the engineering. The engineering is a tool. It's about humanity. It's about connection. It's about how technology makes us better in our life. It's not about the technology. It's about what we can do with it and how it changes what we do. And so that has significantly impacted my motivation for what I do and where we go and what we're trying to achieve. And then I'll come up more through. But we wanted to help this individual as well as others that have stories very similar to this. And so what we did, and so the big problem is the prosthetic that he had, the interface before our work, had no sense of touch. And so it was essentially a tool on the end of his arm. It was a prosthetic. It would grab things, but it was no more part of him than if he picked up a hammer with his other hand. They were tools. And so what we do in this case now is that tool to restore the sense of touch, as I was talking earlier, those nerves are still present in the individual. The sensors that pick up that information are no longer biologic, but now we can replace those in the prosthetic hand with technical devices, engineered devices that will feel the pressure which you push on something. We can actually take that and then convert that to a neural signal. We can change the language of engineering to the brain. And then through our neural digital interface, this peripheral nerve interface, we connect back to those wires and put that information in like I described earlier and send that up to the brain. And what happens is, even though we started this information, we based it on what's at the fingertip, we know the right place to apply it to that wire. When we turn that on, the brain just feels it as though it came from the fingertip. It doesn't know that it was electrically generated. It only knows that it was the finger because that's the right wire for it. And so what they feel is then they feel their finger, even though they don't have a hand, they would feel their finger touching something. That's powerful. And so that's what we've been building on for the past basically 12, 15 years. And from the time we conceived of doing this, started the funding process and got going. About 10 years ago, we did our first implant with the system with an individual. And we've been we have two different running investigational device exemptions. Those are what allow us to do this in human work. These are implanted devices. So we work with the FDA regularly, as well as IRB and local things that are actually is one of the advantages of being here in Cleveland, because those processes are well set up in the different institutions to do this. We have over 10 years of experience with this system now in an individual. We have 10 different subjects that have been implanted with these systems, both in the upper, and we do the same thing for the lower extremity. So when you've lost your leg, you can't feel your foot. And so now by stimulating those same wires that used to go to the foot, or wires that used to go to the foot, with the same process, working with Ron Triolo and colleagues, we can do the same thing in the lower limb. So we can restore sensation, whether in the upper limb or lower limb. So across those groups, we got about 10 subjects. We have over 23 different, across these subjects, 23 different lectures implanted. We have 36 of these muscle recordings. So we say EMG, which is electromyogram. These are put into the muscles. So when the person loses their limb, again, they have to control this prosthesis now. And so what you do, the brain thinks about controlling and moving their hands. When they think about moving the finger, while the finger is missing, the muscle that used to control it's up in the forearm. And if that's still there, we can pick up that information that came from the brain, and then we turn that into electrical information and optimally control information and move the finger of the prosthesis. So the user doesn't know the difference. They think about moving their finger and the finger moves on the prosthesis. And so these are the systems we're developing. And I'll talk about at the end of this is that we've now also developed the world's first and most complex bidirectional implanted system as part of the work we're doing, which I'll finish this section on in just a minute. So what have we been able to achieve with this? Obviously, there's not time to go into details. It probably would not be super interesting to the science part, but trust me, we've published a ton of papers on all these things, where most of my literature has come in the last 5-10 years. But within these subjects, we know that we can replace most of the fundamental touch. So when they feel their finger, it feels like their finger. We know we can control the pressure, the amount of force they feel in that fingertip, just like you or I can. They have the same sensitivity to feel how hard they're grasping something. We know that we can control the location. We know where they feel it. So it'll be on an index finger or a middle finger. We can do multiple points across the hand. We know that at least in many of in all of our subjects so far, we'll eliminate the phantom pain. And it's one of these key things that when people lose an arm, they often have what's called phantom pain. And just to imagine how bad this is, one of our subjects, a different one, when he lost his limb, he was working a punch press and had reached in at the wrong time, or something happened and the machine came down and took off his hand at the wrist. Now, when he described his phantom until he began our work, working with us, his phantom was, his hand was always clenched closed. He could never open it. And when he would describe the phantom pain is as though you take that clenched hand and then put it into a vise and crank the vise until the fingers go through the palm of your hand. Now, that's horrific in sounding, but what's even worse is that this is a phantom. If you or I were to hit our thumb, which is not related to this picture, it wasn't intentional, but if we were to hit our thumb, you just sort of grab it and you start to rub it. That's how we can control pain. He doesn't have one to grab and rub. He just has to live with the pain. And it become quite excruciating for many people. And the only solution that exists in many cases are opioids or drugs. And those have many more detrimental side effects. And in fact, our subjects, when we talk to them, they would rather have the pain than they would have the drugs because of the side effects of the opioids. So we've had a significant impact on this phantom pain, where to the subject I was describing, when we turn on stimulation, he starts to feel his hand, but even secondary to that, when he could never open it before, he couldn't think about opening his hand because there's no hand there and the brain's not connected. Once we start giving sensory feedback that comes from the fingers, the brain reconnects to that hand and he could actually start to open up his phantom. And so it made a huge difference in not only what the pain was, but in fact, how he could control his phantom, because now he had this sensory feedback. Proprioception is a fancy term for meaning knowing where your hand is in space, so we can stimulate, they can feel their fingers move. We've built these systems, we've sent them home now with them, and we've been able to study and look at what is the impact on your at-home life. How does it affect your relationship with people that you live with or your quality of life? And we see that all those things improve when they have sensory feedback. We're working out all these asterisks, means these are kind of ongoing work now. How we control that hand to make it as natural as possible. So we can make it do more things. We can make it feel more natural in doing it. I talked about the individual idea of the fingertip or touching in one place. But our brain works in very different ways. If we have something that moves across our hand, it's actually not the single point that we feel, but it's this multisensory integration of the feeling, the movement of your hand, the relative timing between the different points that you feel, and how the brain interprets all that. And so we're looking at how we can stimulate across many different senses of touch to control this multisensory integration and impact of what they're feeling. It's also interesting that, when we started, we thought we had to replace what the hand normally felt, make it as natural as possible. It turns out the brain is a wonderful thing, as you might imagine. It learns. And so this leads us to questions that become much more interesting in the later part of this talk. But what the subjects feel initially, sometimes it's pressure, but a lot of times they describe it as tingle. It's not totally what their hand used to be. It's much better than nothing, and they have definitely the ability to use it. But what happens is the longer they use it, that becomes the new natural. So if you think, for example, of how we even evolve when they're born, we've all seen newborns, they're always reaching around, they're putting things in their mouth, putting things on their face because the lips and the tongue are very sensitive. And so they see what it is, they're touching, they're feeling it. What's happening is the brain is associating this multisensory information. They see something, there's a signal that comes to the fingers, they become associated to learn what that is. So if you touch something rough, that visual of it being rough is now associated with that neural information, that the information coming up the wire, to now create this picture of what rough is. It turns out that's not static. So even now with people who've lost their limb, we're looking at how is it that over time, if we give them a signal, how does that become natural and how much can they learn? And the interesting thing apart that we'll talk later is that now, because we can do this electrically, we may actually be able to do things beyond touch, which is where we start to get to the third part of this talk, which I'll get to shortly. Then we have this whole idea of sensory motor integration. And so what this means is we're engaging the brain. And when people are using a prosthetic hand without sensation in the old, before our system, when they would close the prosthesis, they would basically look at it and they would visually see what it is and issue a command they want to close. But there's no connection between the closing and the brain other than the visual. And visual is an inherently slow mechanism for control. One of the studies we did, or one of the things we played with, was we had them grab a cherry. So we'd have subjects pick up a cherry and grab the fruit in the prosthesis and then try to pull the stem out. And that's the interesting part about that is if you grab too hard, of course, you crush the cherry. If you don't grab hard enough, it slips out. So there's a fine control that they have to do this task. And with vision alone, without sensation, they couldn't do it half the time. They would squeeze too hard, the cherry would break. Changing nothing else except adding sensation. In fact, we would take away their vision. We put blindfolds on them. They could do it every time because now they could feel the touch in their fingertips. The brain interpreted that and changed the control system appropriately to now do this even without watching it in a much more appropriate way. So there's a because of this system, because as I said earlier, we're now talking to the brain directly. We've made this connection. We're talking to the input to the brain. It's now engaged in that control process in a much more active way. And so we're looking at all the things that we can do and how we're truly engaging the brain in the control of this prosthetic or robotic system. And then interesting beyond that is that often when this field started, we talked about the idea of I feel something. And so typically when you or I grab something, for example, the cherry, we tend to think about it, I feel it and I'm controlling it. But what's really happening is a lot of parts of your brain are processing before you even feel that. And so I won't go into a lot of the details. There's some really fascinating science here about things that people can do even though they don't feel it, but they act as though they do. So the brain is processing information before I perceptually feel it, before I can recognize this. And we're engaging those parts because we're in the periphery. All those parts of the circuit appear to be active, and there's some important consequences to that. So it doesn't just mean they feel their finger. There's actually control information in the brain that's beyond perception that's allowing us to do this. So things even like emotion, for example, we're looking at this idea of a colleague of mine, Emily Grotchik, is looking at the affective nature of touch. What does it mean for the emotional component of touch? And it's not really I feel it, but it's actually other aspects of the limbic system and parts of the brain. So there's a lot of really interesting, fascinating things that we get to do. And just because we have this neural digital connection, it allows us to study the sense of touch in ways that we can't do it by other mechanisms as well. So it enhances our science as well as the opportunity to provide something for people with limb loss. So because of that work in our work in the field, ultimately we received about, DARPA gave us about $16 million to develop this into a much more advanced system. So we've had over 30 million for this work alone, other money in different areas. That allows us to bring on partners like Medtronic, RDM, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and a lot of major companies and other institutions to work together. That we've built essentially now the first implanted Bluetooth linked system. So now where we used to have wires that go through the skin to contact, now everything is implanted below the skin. We have essentially a pacemaker. It's one of Medtronic's Activa S cans that we put our own stuff in with them. And it's connected by Bluetooth to an external device. So essentially everything is connected to the smartphone. And ultimately, this means it's embodied. The user has really no perception of this device except what it's doing. So it's not as though they see wires, they see something else. It's part of them. And so when they hit the go on their cell phone, they're now, this hand becomes them. They feel it as though it's their own hand, and they have nothing that makes it look like it's not them. So we've basically directly connected through this Bluetooth link, this hand to their nervous system. So we've made this neural digital connection. And the progress we've made, we were probably one of the top funded DARPA groups doing this. And we were one of the only that I've been told got to the finish line. But because of that, we've actually got some non-dilutive pre-seed corporate development funds also from DARPA to say, we don't want to just develop it, we need to make an impact in the world. And so one of the things that I was concerned with when we started this is only 10 people get this device, it's not going to be very useful. So how can we translate this outside of the lab into commercial? And so we were working towards that right now. So in this process, this is still under VA funding, and the DARPA is that we have a 15 subject randomized clinical trial that we're working on. High degree of freedom prosthesis, so not just open and close, but all kinds of different activity in the hand to make it as natural as we can. Sensory enabled, so they can feel what it is. We had this approved by the FDA. We have a multi-site VA-sponsored trial, working with Case here. Continuous home use. Our first implant was November of last year. We turned the system on, it's working, it still works today. Our subject comes in, so we're very excited about where this is. This is the world's first most advanced bidirectional system that I know of, and others have confirmed that. So all that's great. That's the engineering side. But again, this is an impact to me. This is the person talking about the impact that the actual idea of having sensation has on his life. So I'll let him tell it in his words.
My wife traveled to Washington with me to a conference. First time she had seen the system since I had it implanted. I have the system turned on. I'm meeting people and shaking hands and this, that, and the other. And she comes to the door. So she reaches out and she grabs my hand. And we hugged. I grabbed her arm and I petted it just so I could feel her skin. I was whole. I was complete. This is a tool. When the system's turned on, it's mine. It's my hand. What the system done personally for me, it takes the touch and turns it to an emotional feeling, a physical touch to an emotional feeling.
So ultimately, no matter what I do, and I've seen this 100 times, I always get a little bit kind of caught up every time I hear him talk about his story or anytime I talk with him. It's actually quite phenomenal. So those have been motivating things, but what drove us past that? So into the third part of the talk now, this is the end of what I want to talk about, where we're doing what we're doing. Because about 5 years ago, I started to think, fortunately, the prosthetic community is fairly small. But that also means that translating and making impact so more people like that subject can have this experience is going to be challenging, right? This is a complex system. And so I started to think about what else can we do? Like, where else can we use this? Because a lot of medical technology doesn't come from medical technology. It comes from aerospace or, computer communications. And then we use that technology in medicine, at least within the technical realm. So there's a couple of things that really struck me and led us to the next version. And so this is a different subject. He said, when the first time he took the system home, his granddaughter came up and he said, without the system, I only used my remaining arm because I worried about hurting her. He didn't want to squeeze too hard because he couldn't feel her. But as soon as his sensation, he had picked her right up with both hands. And so the idea that now it becomes him, he can operate with that like normal, I think is telling. But here's the big one. All of our subjects say this, and this leads to a huge leap in where we're headed. My prosthetic with no sensation is a tool at the end of my arm. As I said earlier, it's really not them. With sensation turned on, it's my hand. And when we talk to them, they talk about their prosthesis, and when we turn on sensation, they say they're doing things with their hand. And here's where this gets super interesting, though. That's great from prosthetics, but now we start to think about this is just a robotic system. It looks like a hand, it's made to function like that, but it's a robotic system. And the data we're getting is from a sensor on the robotic system that's conveyed digitally. I can actually stick this hand anywhere in the world and provide the same information over the internet, and it will feel exactly like his hand. The same thing, you won't feel a difference. So now what that means ultimately is we're no longer limited by a hand that's biologically connected to your body. Right? So this is the case where now, even in this case of prosthetics, he's feeling things like they're his skin, even though they're not. But even if you have your hand and we could connect this, now I could put another device somewhere else in the world and it could still feel like your hand in that world. We're no longer limited by the biology for that connection, because now I can bypass that and do this neural digital connection, and I'll give you that sense at a distance. And so now we can imagine things like as follows, and this is where this bigger picture and we think is a revolutionary or disruptive idea, is that imagine the situation now where we could create systems where you can be playing with your granddaughter who's in Cleveland from your living room in Florida. So you could hold her hand, actually feel her hand. You could play blocks with her and hold your daughter's hand, all while you're as though they were in your living room. So imagine if we view how HoloLens is going forward, or these VR systems where you can create a system where you have a visual of what's happening in Florida in front of you. And when you reach into that visual, you actually touch that what's happening in Florida through some mechanism. And the same thing on the other side, you can have this two-way link that when you connect, you're interacting with them and they can reach back and interact with you. So now, not just the VR world that we talk about in a lot of ways where you create this other universe, and those work as well, but you can actually create this sense of touch, which brings embodiment. It brings the actual feeling of being there. So embodiment comes from visual tactile synchrony, not just vision. If you've ever done the VR work, when you reach to touch something, it's not there, it breaks the illusion. But if you touch it and grab it and manipulate it, either in the virtual world or even you can manipulate real world objects at a distance, it becomes a very different thing. And that's what we think we're enabling. So let me talk about that a little bit and I'll finish. So where we're headed is we think that by doing this, we can actually scale the human. And what I mean is that your location is no longer limited by your skin, because I can now take data from a different place and I can put it through this neural link, which would be your hand. Now your hand can effectively be wherever I can get data from and provide it through the link. Similarly, like that prosthesis, it's not the capability of your muscles. I can record what they're doing, but I can push that through any robotic system. So now your capability is not limited by the muscle and the biology that you have, but it's only limited by the technology connection that I can create from it. So by bypassing or being able to tap that signal both on the input and output phase, we can, I don't want to say bypass, but we can utilize or now make that digital connection to a system that's not necessarily at your biological limit. The beauty is we don't have to remove the biology. It's a totally decision thing. So we can connect you or not connect you, and you can use your normal hand in a normal way. So it's not like we're replacing, we're actually scaling your capability. And then we can use this for things like resilience. There's a lot of places where people work now that are very dangerous. Chemical factories, bottom of the ocean, these type of places where they're very dangerous for the individual. And so now we can work on resilience where we can put the robotic system there, but because you're connected directly, because we're putting input to the brain, using the brain, the output back, what we've done is not made it a teleoperation where you're working remote controls and things and seeing something at distance. We can actually put you in that system. So you can imagine a camera system at that, under the ocean, in space, wherever it happens to be. You put on your VR headset, that's what you see as though your head is there. And when you move, now that system is moving out there as though it's your arm and you're feeling things when you touch. You become that system. So even though you're not there, your entire mental capability has been moved to that orientation. And so now again, it scales us in location and capability and our resilience. And that's the goals. We do that by, as we said, I don't believe that technology, and I know there's a lot of people that talk about AI outstripping human. In my personal view, AI as a misnomer, but machine learning is super important, but it's in connection with the human intellect, the creativity. Our lifelong experience brings things to what we do. So, a machine learned on a small data set is not the same thing as a human that's lived a life. And so our ability with unstructured problems, extrapolation, which are typically challenges for the technology, we can bring the human in with machine learning and better data processing and analytics, the robotics, the computing, and connect those to this neural digital connection to now make a much broader opportunity in system. So this is where we're connecting these ideas of VR, AR, the HoloLens, which is an important thing here, Case. You can imagine the work that's going on with holoanatomy. If we were to connect touch that, you could actually feel the cadaver and maybe feel the differences in tissues. We're developing neural interfaces, wearable. These are things that anybody could use. We have the implanted for the prosthetics, and we're working on these things that are broader audience for minimally invasive, but nothing more than a shot. And so how we continue to expand this interface. This would also work, by the way, with stuff that other colleagues here that are in brain-computer interfaces and other ways of connecting to the nervous system. So all are viable. If we connect those to these edge devices, such as the robotics, the industrial machines, essentially anything we can imagine now where the human brain can be put into it, these are the opportunities and the things we're just starting to explore and expand on right now. We're doing this, we're developing this neural reality network. And so we have created a basic platform where we take this data, we kind of make it into a generic concept that we can send it to any robotic or environmental system, collect that data back and put it back in, bypassing the sensation, but connecting the wire to utilize the brain. So essentially we can now, where the brain would normally get sensation from the environment to itself, to its muscles, we can actually bypass those and push those through a network system to make it remote, to make it distant, to make it different systems. So this neural reality platform is what we've been developing. I'll show you an example where we done this. We have nodes set up in Cleveland and UCLA. We work regularly with a group in the robotics at UCLA, where a person in Cleveland is controlling a robot in UCLA, feeling and grabbing an object. I put this picture in the corner. I think it's interesting. This is the ARPA-E early network, and CASE was one of the primary nodes on there. So when I had drawn this independent, and I went and looked, and it's kind of interesting how this grew out of ARPA-E. I think we're at the early days of growing this neural reality idea, and I found the analogies interesting. So here's the thing, though, where I think it goes beyond that, and this is where technology, and this is sort of my essence of humanity is beyond the technology part, is that it's all the scale, within CASE, all the schools are involved, because we can't just build the technology. What happens a lot in our tech industry now, we see lots of examples of this, is people build the technology but don't think much beyond it. So how do we build that technology? But we also think of what are the ethics of doing it. For the human-machine connection, when you put yourself out there, where are the boundaries? And so what is the ethics of doing that? How do we regulate it? How do we translate that? And what are the social impacts of that, right? So again, this loop we talked about earlier, technology driving humanity, driving technology. We can't just do that in isolation. We need to work together. So we want to create a structure, an institute where all of these folks are working together to talk about this. And I've learned more from phenomenologists and ethicists about how we build the technology right in the beginning before we send it out there and have a big problem to try and fix later. So this is something I think crosses the entire institution. I put this up here. I don't have time to go through it. I remember my grandma telling me stories about running across the field to listen to a box to hear a man's voice from New York. And I just point out that, 1903 was the first Marconi transmission of a wireless transmission. TVs of 1914, ARPA-E in 67. CASE started using all these technologies in biomedical engineering for medical health in the 68 or so. Grew up with them. We've been a leader in that area. Cell phone, all these communications now matured. And I actually think that we can be at the forefront of this neural digital connection going forward as well, which is CASE can lead that. We have done this. This is the examples of a robotic system we've created. We did this for an X Prize, an avatar. We get to the semifinal round. This is a system. This person now is wearing that non-invasive interface. She is feeling things in her hand when a robotic system is grabbing it in a totally different room. She is seeing through this camera in here. She's controlling this hand and feeling what's connected when it's doing something in another room. And so this has been a collaborative between us, UCLA, Cleveland State, University of Wyoming, and Temple. And I wanted to thank several groups that have helped. This is new things. We don't have necessarily government funding. We're trying to create a new area. So the Dupuy family, the Kimball family, Aiken family, Case Visiting Corporation, and donors from the alumni annual giving campaign have actually been really critical for getting this off the ground and trying these initial concepts we're starting to build on. There's about a $400 billion total accessible market in these areas. I'm going to skip this from a time, but just saying this is not a small area for us to be looking at. We all have heard about Meta. I have my comments about that. But Meta, actually, they acquired a company for $500 million and actually $1 billion if they meet all their milestones just to go to Meta. And that was only for the control part. They don't have sensation yet. So there's a huge opportunity there and other things that are going on. We're looking at application domains. We talk about healthcare and the prosthetics and pain management, but even healthcare avatars, that remote system that can actually do healthcare from a remote in an area. But we can also look at space and industrial or military applications where explosive ordnance disposal, which is the most dangerous job in the military, now can't be done very well by robotics. But if we could replace that, remove the human from the explosion area, working in space, underwater operations, but manufacturing and warehousing, which I'm happy to talk about, just give you a taste here. And then edutainment, of course, gaming. But there's also interesting areas in the humanities of new art media. How do you provide sensation of the hand and play, not just audio visual, but actual tactile experiences? So I think there's a lot of opportunities in this. Fits well within the North Star of the strategic alignment here at the university. Interdisciplinarity, as I said earlier, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Human and technology, that is what we are. Social impact, we of course want to lead the way in doing this, and then shaping the agora is that we think that technology should be used to bring people together, not expand the digital divide, but make it smaller. We need to bring voices in so that the needs of all of our communities are built in early in the technology phase. Like I said, that loop is not build tech and see what happens, but build tech in the context of community and social and build what's needed for everyone. So this idea of being inclusive and the idea that we can now bring people together in ways we never could before is actually encouraging to me, and an opportunity for us to be much more as a community rather than all the divisiveness. And so again, areas I would be happy to talk about from time. I just want to introduce it. So we're creating this Human Fusions Institute. The core ideas are multiple institutional partners. As I mentioned before, we are all about a transdisciplinary team. It's not just engineering. We want to build a tech platform for people to build other ideas off of, so that neural reality platform, other people could be working on all different kinds of technology. But we need to build new education. So not just for the neural reality, but in the future, humans and technology, we're never going away. But we've always taught engineering isolated from humanities. So we're looking to build more of a transdisciplinary education system. And we're currently in the final round of hopefully getting some NSF funding to build a graduate program where we actually integrate humanities and technology at a much deeper level. Develop this ecosystem for spinning out technology and making advantage of that 400 billion opportunity, then really develop this infrastructure for developing more grants and support to study this whole area and grow out. And our mission is to build an interdisciplinary team, ultimately to create a thriving, just, and connected world through the symbiotic human-technology relations to push them forward in a new way. So this summarizes this talk, what we've done, just the people that are building HFI, and not just myself, but our collective group has over 100 years of experience. There's over 100 million in funding total. We have well over 80 patents amongst our group and 1,000 publications. I've talked about some of the success, and we're building out, even talking with AWS, for getting development of this neural reality on a backbone. We needed a real network system, and ongoing partnering that we're building out. So we've been successful. We're looking to build. We're just getting started at this point. So I want to finish with this comment. I like this phrase. It's actually this gentleman's from MIT and kind of envisioned the network, the World Wide Web, or long ago. But essentially, technology is an inseparable part of humanity. And for our true progress to occur, the two must walk hand in hand, with neither one acting as servant to the other. So the goal going forward is not so much of technology versus human, but technology integrated with human. And while up till now we've used technology, because we can now make this neural-digital connection, we're on the precipice of moving forward. We actually embody technology. I think that opens a whole new world, which is the core. So I'm going to finish. I have to thank many, many people. I couldn't put all their names on there. I'm only a very small part of a very big group that's done this in the prosthetics area of companies and students and surgeons and clinical staff. And then also within the HFI, the human fusions and that robotics group, we have multiple institutions, many people working on this as students. So it's an exciting area. It's growing. I appreciate, hopefully I was able to give you some idea what it is. And with that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
We do have some questions that came in over the course of your talk, and then some that had arrived before it. First of all, I want to thank you for just a incredibly information rich, very dense, but very logically oriented talk. I think all of us learned a great deal tonight, as I always do when I listen to you, Dustin. The first question that we had, you spoke to a little bit. Somebody asked about what your motivations are. What motivates you as a person? What motivates you as an academic? What motivates you as an engineer? And you spoke about some really compelling stories that I teared up when I saw the video. I really did. And but I'm curious if you're speaking specific to the prosthetics, or if you really have found that your worldview sort of got altered.
Yeah, I will say that, as an academic, as an individual, I have always been driven by curiosity first off, right? So in the beginning, as long as I can remember, the best questions I could think of, and this will sound like an HP advertisement from old ago, was what if, right? So I love that, and just digging in. So that drives me personally. But from an engineer, is how can I create different things? How can I use information to do different items? And that sort of drove me initially, just the curiosity of how the brain worked, how it was technically related to to computers. So that was the beginning part of my career, and really was this fascination. But I've worked with people in the past that was spinal cord injury and swallowing with dysphagia, but it wasn't until I worked day in and day out with people with the prosthetics that really showed me a very different aspect of what technology. Well, for me as an engineer and a technologist, it's about the technology, right? Right. It turns out for most of the world, it has nothing to do with that. It's not about what technology itself for the interest. It's about how it makes their life better, what the impact is. And so listening to our subject, and yeah, I've heard this 100 times, and every time I do it, I get a little bit of like, wow, this is why I do my job. And so at the end of the day, prosthetics started it, but what it really opened for me is that technology needs to make our lives better. And what does that really mean? It's not necessarily efficiency, it's about connection. And I can tell you, really at the end of all this, everybody I've asked, everybody we've talked to on the prosthetics particularly, said, why do you want to be involved? Nobody has ever told me to make the hand better, right? Or to make it look like my hand. Every single person I've talked to has said, I want to hold somebody's hand. And so prosthetics was a starting point, but really when you start to think about almost everything we do, we're about connection, right? We're about community. And if you think about over time, how have communities formed or not, it's been about the connections they make. There's some interesting literature by Yuval Harari that talks about sapiens, if you've read it, right? Sapiens is the name of the book. It talks about evolution. Now, the size of our community is also directly related to the communication that we have available to us. When you can only talk to each other's stories, it's about 100 people. When you can start to get television, radio. So I've kind of put up that slide about communication because our societies have grown and our connections have grown by that size of communication. So I look at this as a change in communication, and imagine, and I'll stop at this point because there's a million things, but it's sort of like, it's about the people and what it can do with their lives. And imagine now if you could truly empathize with somebody. It's one thing, we've all been to a powerful movie, right? Where you see and the music is playing and you felt like you're in the area and it really impacts you. But now imagine if you could actually feel what's in that area. And I mean, empathy is a totally different thing. That's why, how do we bring communities together? How do we do this? Not just through prosthetics, but even in connections and saving people and getting them out of environments from robotics, experience different environments, being able to go to a community. I don't have to fly. I don't have to go through areas, but I could actually be sitting with you. And I know that's what the metaverse is, but actually changing that to where we can hold hands, we can touch, we can interact with stuff at the same time. So it's about bringing communities together. It's about working, humans to achieve their potential, but actually expanding what that potential could be.
So let me follow up on that a little bit. So how the students who come to work in your lab, the students who are undergraduate students, or the students who are graduate students, do you have a sense of what motivates them? Why is it an important thing for them to come to this university?
Well, I think for one, everybody that I recruit is motivated somehow by improving people's lives, right? I mean, that's one of the things that is actually motivates me to hear the students get motivated. So we typically get people that want to make a difference. They come because they know CASE does this, that we actually work with people. I mean, I think the idea of being a research where you can talk to the individual. So one of the things that I think is often attractive, both for undergraduates and grad, and I have both in the lab, I think it's critical that they experience this, is they can talk to the individuals, right? I mean, these people sit in the lab doing the experiments. It's not like the person that's there doesn't talk to them. They spend most of their time, they know each other. They learn what the things that drive them. And so it's about the humanity. And I think the real key here is that, and again, why we want to create an educational program and build out on this is it's not just technology. It's humanity and technology, and those two work together. And so if students are motivated by that, and I hear more people than ever come in, hey, I want to work on this because I want to expand what we can do for helping people.
So you didn't want us to talk about how old you are, but you've been at this for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how far you had to work sort of behind the scenes before the impact was recognized, and it sort of went from being science fiction to being therapeutic, if you know what I mean, where it seemed concrete and real.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I told you we've been working on it for 15 years. 5 of that was just getting through the FDA, getting the technology to the level where I could put it in something. I spend way more of my time working with regulatory, making sure we're doing everything that follows the rules and all that. That is not the fun part of my job, but when I can sit with that person and they tell me what you've seen, every bit of it's worth it. So the background is actually huge, and it takes a ton of effort. I mean, we can talk about the results, but to get here, very few places in the world can do it because it's a huge effort, right? I mean, we're building on a lot of things that have been the case for a long time that built the foundations for us, but it requires not just the scientists and the students sitting in the lab, but we have engineering staff that do phenomenal jobs. I work with some engineers here at CASE that Medtronic said, it's too hard for us to do, and our engineers did it. I work with fantastic people that, to me, are motivated by and this will get to your other question, people are motivated by helping people. And I love that, because what happens is the FDA is they're important, but they're also a lot of work. Regulatory is a lot of work, yet everybody's doing it because they know at the end they're going to have an impact. And so, it takes a lot of background work, and we spend a ton of time with protocols and paperwork and engineering and testing and all of that. But at the end of the day, when we can see this make a difference in person's lives, it's so worth it.
So I want to come back to the Cleveland and the CASE question, but first of all, I want to get to a specific question that somebody asked, because I think it actually opens up kind of a large question. So let me read this. So if someone is suffering from pain from peripheral artery disease in the leg, and it can greatly limit somebody's ability to walk, to hike, and the background pain can make itself felt throughout the day. Do you see something in the pipeline that could serve as a partial prosthetic that could replace the affected area past the knee to above the ankle, but yet retain the foot? And if I could just tag my own little bit onto the end of that question, it's an interesting question when there's a loss, you're working on replacing something, but when there's an impairment, you have competition between the signals that are coming from the wounded limb and then also the technology that's serving the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. And there's not a simple answer to that, right? So it depends on a lot of different aspects of where the pain is coming from and how it's behaving. Because there are lots of pain is actually quite complex. I mean, there's a simple pain of your nerves are firing in the lower limb, the foot, for example. And not myself, but colleagues here at Case, Kevin Kilgore and his team are working on technology that we can implant on the nerve, but rather than causing signals, they can actually stop them. So in a case where the pain is coming from the foot, they would actually prevent that from getting to the brain. So while we've been trying to engage the brain, they're trying to disengage the brain. So there are solutions that people are working on for that. And then also sometimes the pain is centrally, right? So you had something that hurt in the foot, but now your brain just says that's what it's used to doing. And so by putting in information in the periphery, so in peripheral artery disease, a lot of times what happens is distally you have the pain because the nerve is compromised, right, physiologically. But proximally, the nerve is still functioning fine. And so if we stimulate there, we can provide a natural sensation. We could potentially, like I said, prevent other signals. So it's not an easy question, but the answer is yes. There are different ways that people are looking at this. The other aspect of this is in a lot of peripheral artery disease after the pain. So one reason you might amputate the leg is for pain, but the other is if you don't feel it. So people often describe their foot being in cement. And then what happens is you get wound ulcers because you don't feel your foot, you don't move it, and they have necrotic tissue. That we can, even just using this technology, so even though you haven't maybe lost the limb yet, we can put it in, and while the nerve distally may not be responding, we can put a sensor in the shoe and then provide that feedback so you feel your foot, even though the foot isn't actually getting the information. We're just sort of jumping that gap where the nerve isn't working. And what we hope that can do is maybe prevent the amputation or at least delay the duration before you have that. So there's a lot of different combinations where the technology and the injury or the condition are working together. So while the answer is not one fits all, there's a lot of tools that we've been developing through myself and our colleagues that are possibilities.
So maybe this will tie things together. So the fact is you synthesize a lot of different technologies together in what you're doing. And as you think about this question that came up here, you see a synthesis of different approaches probably being the most powerful way to go. So that leads me back to this question about Case Western Reserve University and what's special here. So you had quite an impressive list of partners, and you mentioned Medtronic a couple of times, but there's Lawrence Livermore National Lab and other large things here. And if you think about the AR, VR world, there are very big companies, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon all playing in that space. So what is it about Case that's unique that allowed this to be the right place for this to be developed?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question for even going forward. You think of Meta and these other companies and what they're doing. Why we're different is that we've always been human and human connection first, right? So I think a lot of those companies develop software, they develop cool packages, they develop pieces and see what they can do, right? They're about the technology driving the human. We've always been about the human interacting with technology, right? In that way. So for 60 years, we've been figuring out, it's been in medical, 70 years now, right? It's in medical, but we've been really learning how the human and the technology work together. It's not simple, right? I mean, it's much more complex than building a cool widget and seeing what happens. So we have the unique position here, I think, of actually really understanding the human interaction with technology in a way that most places don't. And at this neural digital connection, very few places in the world are at the level we are. So it really puts us in a unique light. And I personally, my belief is we need, there's Silicon Valley and the coast and et cetera. Cleveland is the human, I don't know, we can call it anything we want. It's the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, the co-valley. It's the human part. And we can apply that technology, and we have a strong engineering, we have strong medicine, and we've had them together for a long time. And now it's to build that whole picture out around the entire human experience is what I think the opportunity is, to extend beyond the biomedical and the medical and engineering, but all of the humanities and all of the human aspects of this are not just bringing, sick people to healthy, but taking anybody and scaling them to the next level.
Well, that is a fabulous note, I think, on which we should conclude this evening. I see that we are at 7 o'clock. I want to thank you, Dustin. I always, like I said earlier, always learn a lot when I listen to you. I'm always thoroughly engaged when I listen to you, and I am sure that the people who joined us this evening are as well. So thank you very much for all the time and effort that you put in to getting this ready and delivering it this evening.
Thanks, Jim, and I thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope it was interesting for everyone, and I look forward. I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to connect.
Okay, and we will make sure to get them in touch with you if they reach out to us.
Awesome.
I want to add my thanks to the greater Case Western Reserve University community who joined us this evening. It is always a great pleasure to communicate directly, even if it is remotely. Before we sign off this evening, I want to be able to announce that we are shifting, and we are going to have, for the first time in 2 years, an in-person Think Forum F. Joseph Callahan Distinguished Lecture, and it will be taking place on the 18th of April, which is a Monday, at the Maltz Performing Arts Center. And the featured speaker will be Anna Lemke, a clinical scholar and the New York Times bestselling author of a book entitled Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, which is a very provocative title. You can register for tickets at case.edu/events/thinkforum, and that link will be put up on the screen here in a minute. And in the meantime, again, I would like to thank you, and we are looking forward to having you join us on the next such occasion. Thanks again.